Hey everyone, welcome to episode 5. My name is Sam, and as always, I'm here with Jonathan. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date on all our weekly topics and discussions about everything Truvle. Because today we'll be talking about business analysis.
So I know this is a topic very near and dear to your heart, Sam. You've spent a lot of time thinking about it. So why don't you kick it off for us?
Near and dear to my heart is one way to put it. Also a perpetual pain in my side. But yeah, I'm happy to start the conversation off. Business analysis is one of those things that everyone's heard of it, I feel like, who's worked on projects. And, there's the IIBA, there's trainings, there's certifications for business analysis. But I find consistently in all of my engagements over the course of my career, it is the most underestimated and difficult and fundamental part, like the most critical part of project work. I'm really big on communication. And again, people are probably starting to see that we talk a lot about definitions. But the business analysis piece, I just want to have a higher level conversation today about where it fits into project work, what it is, defining it again, and kind of understanding from our perspective where things are going wrong. Because again, it's one of those ones it's out there, but it's failing a lot. I know you, Jonathan, you've had a lot of issues with this too in your career in various ways.
And I think I'll just pick up from where you were starting to say about a definition. Usually when people think about business analysis, they go straight to business requirements or doing analysis to gather requirements for development for IT. And I think that that's probably, the most common use of it. But it really is any time some aspect of the business needs to be understood and you need to bring together various stakeholders and various subject matter experts and use certain techniques and methodologies to elicit a solution to a problem or to seize an opportunity. And very often that solution is in the form of requirements that need to go to IT. So just because I know we get so focused on the definitions and rightly so, anything to add to that, Sam?
I have a lot to add to that because part of it is, like Jonathan mentioned, we think of it a lot in the SDLC, so the software development lifecycle, and we think, okay, we need somebody who's in there building requirements so that they can go into some dev's queue and they can start building software off of it, basically. But it's so much broader than that. Anyone who's been in this role or hired for this role or kind of worked with this role on projects knows that, okay, once you start developing requirements, it's such a difficult exercise. It takes a lot of communication. It takes a lot of translation. You're often tying together multiple stakeholders from different places. You're talking to engineers on one hand, business people on one hand, possibly vendors, people from all over the board. Also, oftentimes like higher level executives want to see the requirements and sign off on them, which is also a crazy thing if you think about it, because they're supposed to be very detailed and explicit. But then a lot of times they're being floated up and they expect them to be summarized so that somebody, at the top is going to sign off on them. And just even what a requirement is often very ambiguous. Everyone talks about requirements, and a business analyst's job is to manage requirements. But then even the definition of requirement is so ambiguous. So it's just a lot packed into it. But generally, yes, everything about business analysis is managing requirements, but really translating operating reality is how I like to say it. It's kind of like you guys who do business analysis, you're a translator, so that whatever you see is happening in the operating environment can be transcribed into documentation so it can be communicated and analyzed. And everything within that is part of the discipline.
And when you just hit documentation, I think for me, the biggest problem I see with business analysis is people not understanding where it fits in and actually how to deploy it and what it is. And if you look at the history of waterfall development versus agile development and even iteration since then, like event storming, what you find is that there's this reaction to any formal process, any sort of formal business requirements documentation, or anything that feels like it's too slow. And it makes sense because the pace of business and the pace of change is such that, to some extent, you can't go through some a slow and methodical process. Well, let me say differently. You can't go through some slow process. The problem is that it's replaced the methodical element of it, the predictable element of it, the repeatable element of it, with something that's a lot more like that looks to me a lot more like chaos. So so I think that the requirements process, and granted, if you have tons of pages of business requirements documents that nobody's ever going to read, or doesn't have some purpose to it, that doesn't make sense either. But you can't have absolute chaos. You can't have absolutely nothing and no traceability and no predictability to the process. And so I think that that's for me, that's really the first starting point, is where does it fit in? And I don't think there's one answer for every organization, but that's what I notice as one of the biggest problems.
But there's fundamentals. I think that's the part that I'd like to talk about now, which is that, yes, it's going to be different because everything's become more flexible with the agile revolution, I guess you would call it. Because, well, maybe let's start there for a minute, because I think Jonathan's point is exactly right on the button, which is that nobody knows where to put this role. Nobody knows where to put this function a lot of the time. I mean, it's supposed to be in there, but with the project landscapes kind of changing and the project life cycles being highly variable with now more agile project work, it's a bit hard to slot it in. But I think it's worth talking about a little history here, because this has happened in the last decade, where everyone went from waterfall to agile methodology. And it was very fast, if you think about it. It was kind of like a mutiny, really. And this touches on some of Jonathan's points, where people had a very methodical and standard way to do very detailed documentation. The classic business requirements document, or BRD, there was hundreds of templates. They were all starting to look fairly standard. And it was, somebody had to sit down and pound those out, 30 hours a document, doing line by line, getting all the stuff. And then nobody was reading them. And that was what Jonathan was saying, which is, okay, well, it doesn't make sense if no one's reading them, but people who were reading them, they were very detailed. Now, they were too slow, and that's the whole agile revolution, really, which is saying we don't have the time to do such heavy documentation. But now a lot of people in this space have been talking about how, well, now it's the Wild West. Now agile is giving people leave to document nothing. So now I'm a business analyst in an agile organization, and it's kind of up to you. So not only with all the stuff we talked about at the beginning of the episode, where I've got all these responsibilities, all this difficult translation stuff, but now you also have to pick the methods you're going to use to document requirements, and you have to do it faster with that same fundamental discipline, but in all sorts of flexibility.
That's assuming, Sam, that in the revolution for agile, you didn't lose the whole role of the business analyst, because all too often what we're seeing is that the development team often is developing, and there's no clear process by which they obtain the requirements. So sometimes it's unclear that there was even a business analyst that was part of that process. Business analysis work is being done always, because in order, someone's doing some sort of analysis and figuring out that X requirement meets a solution, that needs to be met. But you can't actually figure out who and where that all came from.
Right. Well, that's an extremely important point, because in Scrum, like your traditional Scrum team, there is no business analyst anymore. Part of the mutiny was, we don't even want this role named that. We don't own it around. Everyone, it's sort of PTSD from the BRD phase in projects, and nobody wants to even talk about it. But you have the idea in Agile is you have a product owner who is the business, and they should just be talking about their whatever they do and owning it. And then you have the dev team, and then you basically have a project manager. So those small agile cells, which everyone's trying to deploy, and I still see it every day, even in the present, it doesn't have a business analyst role. So somehow the product owner, who is typically part of the business, they have their day job, they're part of the project, they own this product, they're supposed to be translating what they need to developers in a project sense. And like you said, business analysis is happening there, whether you want to put on your blindfold and ignore it or not. It's just sloppy and ad hoc, because the product owner is just trying to articulate themselves to dev teams as best they can, but they basically have to reinvent the fundamentals that have already been tested for a long time every time they get on a project. And I think people in Agile now are starting to find that's a little bit tiresome.
And if you have those Scrum teams, and if the technology is being developed successfully, and people are getting the solutions that they want, and the market's responding, et cetera, then that's a good process at the end of the day. And you want to see, how is this repeatable? How, why is this happening the way it is, the way it's happening? So you make sure you retain that. So it's not so much that you necessarily need only one process to follow. The problem is that in most instances, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing some scenario where everyone's super happy with the technology and all the customers are saying everything's perfect, or the business internally is saying everything is perfect. We're seeing a lot of argument about why is it so slow, or why, does this not work, or the development team saying nobody's giving us requirements, or so you're seeing a lot of symptoms that something is missing. So we're not arguing, certainly I'm not arguing for some specific structure that has to be followed in every scenario, only X works. But if you're seeing the symptoms that I just described, then there's usually a very clear breakdown in the business analysis and the requirements process.
For sure. And yeah, I want to reiterate, no one's trying to bring back the BRD at Truvle. Like, that's nauseating. We all agree with that. And it's very long and lengthy, and often there's no ROI on it. But also having no documentation is causing a lot of problems. And that's what we're seeing now. It's a very good summary of where business analysis is at right now, which is that we don't want you to spend a ton of time with documentation, but dev teams need something consistent. I mean, that's, I think, really what it is. It's consistency in the language, in the translation, because the dev teams don't want to sit here and say, oh yeah, put together a super heavy document we have to consume, but they also want something. They don't want to just show up in a room and then have a conversation and then go back and start coding and it's wrong. Like, Agile works until the iterative sprints keep producing wrong over and over and over. And I think we're seeing that more prove out in real time. So what you're going to end up seeing is that gap is going to be more pronounced, which is, we can't understand what the business needs because we're just doing this on the fly, and the business is getting frustrated and they're trying to articulate their needs. And it's almost like they're saying, we need somebody who's a professional translator. And now it's going to come right back around. That's the business analyst role.
And you often have the business, they don't want to articulate it too clearly because they don't want to be constrained. Maybe there's some great some great solution I don't know about, or so the business is often very hesitant. And the IT was always under pressure, or development, I should say, is always under pressure to develop. Customers are demanding XYZ, the business is demanding XYZ. So whether or not the requirements are coming in, things are being developed, even no matter what the process ultimately is, and the business isn't clear either. I think the best balance is usually if the business is super clear about what their problem is, not how they want the technology to work or what specific solution they want, but they're very clear about their problem. And IT is very good at solutioning, or the development team or product owners are excellent at solutioning. And that's why we keep coming back to business analysis, because somewhere between that business problem and the specific implementation or the specific execution from a technology perspective is this analysis and the bringing together of the various stakeholders that need to be brought together, and the interpretation and the translation, as Sam said, that's the space that we're really talking about.
Yeah, and it's always, again, it's always there. You cannot avoid it. No matter how much you want to not have the role, you don't want to label it, you don't want to, bring attention to it, it happens. And the problem we're really seeing is that the business does not know how to articulate what they need in a project sense a lot of the time. They may know what they need, they may not. The idea of a product owner in Agile is really that they represent the business in real time, and they should always be involved in the conversation. And that fundamentally, absolutely agree. But 9 times out of 10, a product owner is not trained to speak in requirements. They could be speaking solutions. And this is what, Jonathan was just saying, they could be speaking what they need. They could be speaking to a problem. They come at it from different perspectives because they're just going to talk about the business, how they see the business. There has to be somebody there who's trained to understand how that relates to the project, how it's actually going to relate to a dev team. To think that's going to happen naturally by itself on every project without being addressed is it's just fundamentally missing this piece again. It's just missing that this has to happen by somebody.
And there is some trend, over time, an organization's going to find some homeostasis with this problem. And the way they do it is that all the different parties start developing a certain institutional knowledge and a certain knowledge about the business or about IT and I keep saying idea, I should say development, or software development or product, that the two groups start understanding enough of what the other knows that they could start doing more autonomously, which is, it does result in more product, in more execution. The problem is it still is usually off the mark because it's missing this analysis. It's missing a true understanding of an articulation of the problem and how to translate that into something that is useful for the consumer. So I guess what I'm saying is that the product groups that seem to do the best are the ones that are effectively doing their own business analysis and start anticipating or understanding the business or the customer without the engagement that we're, on some level that we're talking about. And again, that achieves a certain result, but the methodical way of developing requirements and bringing those skill sets to bear is what's going to get a lot more predictable result and a lot more innovation, frankly.
Yeah, and that's the part that is, I think that's a very important point you just made, which is that it will happen. There is a learning curve. And if you have teams working together, a lot of times this happens naturally. They start translating for each other, they start doing the analysis, and it starts happening. But the point, is the important point is, why recreate the wheel every time? Business analysis is a known subject or domain or field where there's a lot of work done, and you can always adapt in your organization. But the thing is, if you're going to say, okay, we're going to build a house, and we already know there's carpenters and electricians and things, but you're just going to get together with your team and then reteach yourself how to do electronics in carpentry because you're not bothering to engage with the skill set, you'll get it eventually, maybe, but it's not an effective way to do things. And I think we come back to this a lot, which is that, start with the building blocks that are all out there, but you have to adapt them to your context. You can't say, okay, I'm doing agile, or I'm doing this project and I'm not going to need business analysis, or I'm not going to need some business analyst skill set. There's no project that exists anywhere where that function or that work is not going to have to be done in some way. Start without somebody who knows what that is in the team. I think that's a lot of the problem. And like you said, there's no sense to it. There's no sense to rebuilding that capability from scratch. And then that team, as soon as you break the team up, or new players come in, then they've got to storm again. They've got to reform that translation key.
And this comes back to, a lot of things are also blamed on business analysis or the requirements or development for that matter, that really speak more to organizational maturity and the concepts that we brought up last time. So a lot of times a solution that does solve for XYZ problem, the real problem is that there's no transition state. There's no project to implement. And so it's looked at as very, it is very disruptive. So, or an organization that's very immature has a whole bunch of other problems. Who speaks for the business, or who speaks for the customer, or, where are you getting the information from? So even if you do excellent business analysis, it's not necessarily going to result in what you want because the organization's immature. So all the concepts that we brought up last time, and I think this is why we came to something very very pointed on the execution side, or at the tactical side, I should say, in the form of business analysis, is because all these higher level ideas that we have been speaking about apply so acutely to the area of business analysis.
Yeah, and organizational maturity, again, if we just talk about maturity and bringing it down to the individual level, I think this is such a big one, because what I would say about that is it's just starting work without having the capabilities again. I think a maturity thing is, it's just like, if you personally, and trust me, I remember years ago, I was like this a lot. If you said, go do this, well, my first instinct was just get out there and start hammering stuff together and figuring it out on the fly. But as I become more mature, and I think a lot of people go through this as they mature as people and professionals, well, the first thing is they'll try to scope out what they're being asked to do, and they might research and do some learning about things that have already been done so that they're prepared and they have more capability. So they're going in with a little bit more preparation. I think one can relate to that as a more mature and seasoned mindset generally. And it's no different with organizations. The idea that you would go in and you would say, okay, well, every single project is going to need key players, is going to need business involvement. And that's like a real good thing that Agile brought. It's going to have business analysis. It's going to have some sort of solution component and technical maybe design for the most part. And these pieces have to come together. And if you're a mature organization, you identify that and you line up the capability before you get started.
And you just hit on a great point. If the organization's immature and there isn't a lot of alignment, so you need to be able to bring different people together. You don't know who's speaking for the business or for the customer or the user, et cetera, and you have all these other problems. The skill set of the business analyst needs to be exponentially larger, because now they basically need to have an understanding of the operation of operations, of projects, of every dimension of business, because they're the ones that are trying to bring it all together and focus the energy in a productive way. And so what we're deeming business analysis, and maybe we could even come back to that definition a little bit. In an organizationally immature entity, you're always going to see the need for a much broader skill set for business analysis than in a mature organization where it's a lot more focused.
And that I agree. And even in mature organizations, I don't know if I directly say it's immature versus mature organizations. I'd say in mature organizations that are running bigger, more complex projects, I think it's just correlated that their projects have more of a niche and more of a stable role that a business analyst would play.
100%, but I think the people that would be looking at the role and setting their expectations, the less they understand of how the process works, the more expectation is on the business analyst.
That's
so,
true.
You know, I think that's the dimension I was getting to more in the immature organization.
Yeah, well, that's the tricky part is the role. I mean, we're talking about it very much in abstract, but when you're talking about somebody who, again, has to document, has to translate, has to understand scope, has to do analysis, has to kind of bring the business's interest to bear in a accurate way that also aligns with business strategy while trying to translate that to often a development team or a solution team. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff going on. And to your point, if you're an immature organization and you're just throwing people in there with no guidance, it's really going to be on the individual, whether they sink or swim and whether they provide value in that role. And that's what we see a lot, or at least I see a lot. I mean, it's a very risky role when there's so much packed in it. And then in a very, I guess, larger project, or even now more of an agile project setting, it's become even more wild and sort of unscoped. I think that's the element I was trying to get at to your last comment, which is that I think in larger organizations or even more mature organizations that are used to bigger projects, you can have a bunch of analysts who know what they're supposed to be doing, and they can spend many, many hours doing like a more discrete set of tasks. It makes the job a little easier to hire for. Smaller teams, agile teams, I've seen it's all over the place. And these business analysts are trying to get in there and do a particular thing, but then they automatically are just forced to do all these different expansive levels of things, and they're really having a hard time with it.
And again, we're saying, mature, immature. I would say that the first piece of advice I have is, if this is a gap in your organization, you need to understand your organization. You need to understand where are your weak spots. So is it in being able to speak for the business, the user, the customer? Because if that's your biggest problem or one of the clear problems you have, then your business analysts need to be able to create those relationships and bring that alignment. And that's going to take a very different skill set than someone who is receiving clear business problems and just needs to, and I don't say just because it's complicated in its own right, but then needs to take those problems and convert it directly to something that development can use. So there's a broad spectrum of where the business analysis work starts and where it could end, and the types of business analysis work. On one side, it tends to be much more on just the business itself and helping the business identify the problem and the solution that it's seeking to have. And then on the other side, it's you have a humming machine that is pumping out excellent technology, and they really just need a certain structure or structured information so that they can just keep executing. So understanding your organization will help you understand what your expectation should be of the business analyst and what skill sets they should have.
And I'm going to piggyback off that and say that my advice is find, to the point of what's going on in your organization, find who's doing business analysis now, because it's happening. And this plays back what we were talking about before. So not only find out what you need in terms of where you're at and defining the role, but you know somebody's doing it right now. It may not be who you think, but it's out there happening. So find them and figure out where it's happening currently before you even start to think about what the problems are with this process.
And luckily in the technology side, it's very easy to figure it out, because you look at something that was developed and start from what was developed and work with technology to figure the product group to figure out where did they get their information from.
Yeah.
Now that could
How
be,
did you know?
that is a very hard exercise, but it's always findable. In other words, something, so if you trace it like to a, down to the code, line of code, somehow somebody was told to do that. You just keep going backward from there, because a lot of times if you look for where business analysis is taking place, which is the same thing, what I'm saying, but if you're not seeing where if you're not working backward from the solution or the requirement, the problem is that I would say a good 50% of business analysis work that's done is never consumed, because a lot of times in an organization that's really trying to figure out the problem and the solution, a lot of work is being done to figure that stuff out, and a lot of it's being directed. The problem is, and this is I guess this is beyond advice, but specific to the business analyst role, for it to be successful, it needs pull. So in other words, it should be because somebody is requesting it that is going to deploy it in a specific way, as opposed to we just generally need information. Because if you're in that state, then it could be very, very broad. And we'll talk about in a second about where business analysis goes wrong, but just the general idea of working backward from a solution or from how something was developed and to figure out where the business analysis is taking place, I think is helpful.
Agreed. And it's kind of a follow the money sort of concept. And I love it the way you articulated it. It's because a lot of times people bring in this into question because the dev teams or the product teams are building the wrong stuff. And then, if you want to wonder why, like Jonathan said, work it backwards. Where's the sign off? Where did you get the information that led you to this product or this iteration of the product? Where is it coming from? And, if they say, oh, we're agile, so there's no records, there's no documentation, there's no sign off, that's where you start to know you have a problem already in business analysis. If the business analysis is not on record and you can't even find the person who told your product groups or your development groups what they were supposed to be doing, that's a major problem. That's going to start to cause major problems for the organization. A lot of drag, a lot of negative ROI from that kind of behavior. And I'm seeing it more and more in agile teams where they just come to the table and say, oh, we talked about it in a meeting and we're iterative and we're just iterating. But then every meeting they come to, the business is telling them this isn't quite right, or we need to change this. And then you just get caught in these cycles where it just goes on and on and on. And you never actually know what you're trying to do.
And the problem with the advice I gave a second ago about work backward from what was implemented is usually it's being asked, or the only time I think it's really asked, like where the requirements came from, is when somebody's unhappy. So finding that answer is always implicating somebody in a poor way. But from our perspective, from the way we see things, it's not, none of this is even bad. It's not to say that products doing something wrong or business analysis or the business or anybody. It's more transparency, because if nobody could see what's happening, then nobody can do anything about it. You don't even know where to connect healthy energy to a process. So, the second piece of advice I would give is whatever you could do in a process that doesn't seem to be giving the output that people want, the best thing is bring it out to the light. And that's generally, you want it out in the light. In agile organizations, everything's out in the light. They don't even think of it like that.
It has to be.
Yeah.
It has to be.
So if all you do is expose, even expose has a negative connotation to it, but if all you do is surface how requirements are happening right now, it could be addressed, it can be improved, and everybody's life can get much easier. But keeping things in the shadows, because everybody has their distinct measures on which they're being judged, in terms of output, that is a very, very harmful and does not enable you to iterate to something any better. So I don't know if you see that, Sam.
I do. And again, we're not lobbying for heavier documentation. I feel like the agile community is always super afraid of people coming out and saying, oh, we need heavier documentation again. Requirements fundamentally are somebody saying they require something, and another person has to be in the room to listen to that so that they can act on it. That's the entire reason you have a requirements conversation. Even if you just have a recording as your system of capturing requirements, and somebody hearing that I said this is what the business needs, and that somebody else heard it and says, okay, that's what I'm taking on and doing, that's a requirements record. So there's no excuse to say like this has to be like a big thing. It's just, to Jonathan's point, there has to be transparency about where the requirements are coming from and who provided them. They have to come from the business. They have to come from core operations.
And further to the idea about, the coming in and looking at the process, if the first step I would take, if I'm seeing, if I have to come into a process that's not producing the results that people want, would not be to suddenly impose some sort of structure or some sort of outside process or skill set or anything into it. It would be bring it up to the level of transparency, and then figure out what does work. How could it work? So you could start connecting the energy in a more productive way. So, I'll double down on what Sam was saying about, like, we're not trying to impose a BRD or, specific person that's called a business analyst or whatever structure people might think. It's more a matter of these things have to happen for something to be successful. And we would always be looking for what's the energy and how to get that energy connected in a way that it starts to be more productive. And it can't be if it's hidden. It's impossible, because then you just have a lot of wasted activity.
Absolutely. And it's another nod toward the idea of business analysis is just fundamental, because I guess now I'm getting through this conversation, I'm going to amend our definition from earlier to be more high level, right? It's that the fact is, if a business owner, a product owner, could say exactly what he wanted into existence, there would be no need for business analysis. There'd be no need for communicating. The business, I need this solved, and a software could appear out of nowhere or what have you. His intention would be able to be tried one-to-one. When we talk about this being fundamental, project teams, different functional expertises, different groups always have to work together, because business people usually don't code, as a simple example. So you're going to have coders and developers, and you're going to have business folks. And if you need to get a business person's intention over to another group that doesn't have the same experience, doesn't have the same context, a communication has to happen. A translation has to happen. It's like people speaking two different languages. It would be like you telling me business analysis is not, we don't have a business analyst here. I've been in bigger organizations recently, they don't even have a role. They don't even have a business analyst on staff. And it'd be like saying, okay, I'm going to go negotiate. I'm American. I'm going to go negotiate with a Russian delegate, and we're not going to bring a translator. That's what we're talking about. We're not trying to say that, oh, there's not ways you can get around this stuff, but the translation must happen if you want to be effective. That's the point. And you would want somebody who is good at translating to help you.
I'll give another symptom of how it plays out, or how you know that this is lacking and that there's a major problem. It's when the product group is very happy with the product that they created, and it all works and the technology is good, as they're saying it, and then the users are all complaining. So anytime you have that kind of disconnect, and everyone has good reasons, everyone has, and I mean that everyone does have good reasons that they're accurate, but it's a failure to manifest the needs of the business in the technology. And there's no such thing as, in the abstract, good technology or bad. And that gets to our whole conversation before, in earlier times when we were talking about, somebody saying, we're in finance, we need a financial system, state of the art, et cetera. Like, when you start with the technology, you always end up having a major problem. You have to start with the business need and really understand that. And then technology either supports that, enhances it, makes it easier, et cetera, or not. So yeah, I just wanted to give that other indicator from what you were starting to say, Sam.
Yeah, well, I'm sure anyone listening to this right now understands what Jonathan just talked about, which is that, the symptoms of bad requirements and this whole business analysis not being intact is solutions everywhere that just don't work. I mean, that's really what we're summarizing. It's just your solutions aren't working, and people like to point fingers and do whatever, but it doesn't even need to be the case. It's everyone is trying to do a good job. That's what you were just articulating. Everyone is trying to, most people have good intentions, and they're trying to do their work correctly. And there's just a lot of translation problems, especially the more complex or the more groups involved, or people forget that the business is always the core operating business functions. When we talk about operations in our podcast, they drive everything. finance, IT, marketing, HR, you guys are all support functions. A lot of times I feel like IT gets talked about a lot. Finance, I see this all the time. Marketing, you guys answer and support the business. If the business is not giving you what they require, what their needs are, and you're just building stuff, or you have your own agenda, if I ever consulted with a group like this, you could be the best marketing department in the world. You could be making the best things. If I didn't come from a business owner somewhere, you're off base. I think a lot of people forget that. It's the fundamentals again.
I'm not sure anyone with whom you're angry, Sam, is watching, but because we're
I'm not
already
angry.
talking about
Constructive.
passionate,
Indeed.
which is good. Now, the problem becomes if once the organization realizes the gap in requirements, the gap in business analysis, there becomes a ton of pressure on the business analyst. Because now, okay, we realize the problem. We have
or
our
whoever's doing
analyst.
business analysis. A lot of times there's no analyst. It's the pressure falls on whoever is doing business analysis by necessity.
Yeah, and you see that by groups that are suddenly have the work assigned to them because maybe there's a catch-all kind of term in their name. That could be the transformation team or something like that. Or because they have some of the skills that we're talking about for business analysis, so they get it. But once it is assigned, or once it's clear that there's a need and the pressure comes there, then the second wave that needs to be withstood is the business analyst needs to know what they need to be successful, because you can't just consume all the problems of the organization. If there's lack of alignment, if there's lack of clarity, if there's whatever it is, you can't absorb all that and be successful as a business analyst. So what you need to start being really, really good at is when the work comes in whatever form it does, whoever is bringing it to you, that you start having rules and you have an intake process for that, because you'll need to be very clear on scope. You'll need to be very, very clear on the timeline. You'll need to make sure that you're actually being given analysis that needs to be done, as opposed to, we want you to execute this our way in this manner, and we're coming to you because when we go to the product group, they never listen to us. Like that doesn't work. So it has to be clearly some sort of analysis that needs to take place to get to a solution, as opposed to the solution. And then you need to have extreme clarity on who you're supposed to be going to get the information that you need to get, and they need to be told that you're coming. So these are some of the disciplines that need to be really forced on the organization, because if it's not, then it'll just be another reason why you saw that revolution that Sam said about Agile, is people mistake where the problem actually is, and then you use it as an excuse to change a process that potentially could work. And that's a crime. So I think a lot of what Sam and I are really talking about is, no, there are fundamentals. And every time everybody says X didn't work. So, I'll just I'll go on a tangent a second for lean. A lot of times people say, well, lean didn't work. We're going to go to more practical lean or something like that. What they're really saying is they didn't understand the context and application of lean. They didn't understand the transition state or some of the other concepts that we had. It doesn't mean that lean was wrong or that the methodology there was problematic. But it's how it was applied, how it was absorbed, how it was allowed to live. So the same thing is in business analysis. And it's very, very important that the business analysts and that team are very, very clear on how they take in the work. And it could be very destructive to the relationships that you need to actually build to be successful. But otherwise, the organization will never get past that hump, because then what will happen is the analysis will be passed around to different teams because everybody failed until the organization, keeps finding some new way of getting something done unsuccessfully.
Yeah, and talk about misappropriating a project or a process is, you were talking about lean. Agile is one of the biggest ones. I mean, that's what we're really talking about. People are always trying to go agile and they don't really understand it holistically. They want to put in pieces and parts of it that look sexy or appealing, and the fundamentals aren't there. And then the whole thing starts to fall apart. And then they just switch to agile hybrid, or whoever steps up to fix it is like, okay, we're doing a modified agile. That's how they kind of rebrand it. So they're just trying to figure out, guess and check what's working. But that's a whole nother podcast. What I think is really important, and it kind of brings me to a point I wanted to make today that Jonathan was just talking about, is that the fundamentals imply different functions on a project. Waterfall, agile, doesn't matter. You have to have some business player that's going to be giving requirements to somebody, either directly or with the help of a business analyst, and those requirements are going to get processed into a solution. Let's just say that's the highest level. Agile does that faster in smaller chunks. Waterfall does that larger, slower, whatever you want to say. The fundamentals have to be there. And people have different hats, different roles that can do those different functions. So to the point of maturity, if you know the functions are going to happen, you have to have clear lines on all of them, because then otherwise you get the Jonathan situation where your business analyst is quickly overwhelmed. They don't have the authority to wear every hat. Some of the hats have conflicting, tendencies or conflicting agendas. So if somebody's going to wear multiple of them and they're not really briefed or they don't have the expertise, that's going to go awry. There's so many different ways that goes awry. And you have to combat it with a high degree of organizational or project management discipline. And especially if you're going to hire somebody to do this role, that's where business analysts are having a lot of trouble connecting on the marketplace, because I want a business analyst, and let's say I want them to wear hats 1, 5, 7, and 9 on the project. And the people out there are thinking they're being hired for 2, 3, and 1. This happens all the time. I don't know if that's tracking at that level, but it's all about functional discipline. What functions do you need? How are you going to carve them out? Who's doing what? I think that's what you were talking about, right, Jonathan? It's like, if you don't have that in line first, the business analyst is usually the one that suffers the most, because the tendency is what we talked about earlier. When things start going wrong, everyone drives pressure to who signed off on this.
And everyone can relate to it, because if you think about an organization that doesn't really have project management, the first time project management comes in, there is a lot of tension in that, because the project manager is often spending most of their time just trying to organize something so that it has a chance of being productive. And that tension, before it gets to the hump, before it gets over the hump of moving towards something productive, it's about organizing, and it's about creating those bridges and connectors that simply don't exist in the organization. So that's in project management, which is a very clear discipline, or should be much clearer. In business analysis, where it's really bringing different groups together to extract information, or taking data and extracting information and coming up with some sort of solution that meets an objective of the business. Wow, that's really, really broad. And it's much less defined even than project management, although there's tomes on the topic, but not at the level of fundamental understanding or consciousness of a business. So another reason why you need to be really, really tight in the roles and appreciating what is the expectation there. And I know, Sam, you mentioned not getting into Agile, and we'll get into that in another time. But one of the nice things about a Scrum or a lot of aspects of the process is the connectivity, the alignment, and bring people together. The challenge is always at scale. So, but as an organization, the third piece of advice I would always give is, don't worry about scale to start, especially if you have the disarray that we're talking about. Worry about getting it right in any context. And then you could start thinking about, okay, in our organization, how can we replicate it? I think too often organizations go straight to business analysis at scale, and they don't start working at, okay, we're not getting anywhere. We need to just start scoping something much smaller, apply it, keep our connectivity there, keep our transparency in how we're doing this, and then we could talk about how we're going to scale it. So I don't know, Sam, I saw you have a little look when I said something. I don't know if you agreed with that.
No, I'm processing like 1,000 thoughts at once, and I know we're starting to run our time, so you're not seeing me react to anything particular you're saying. I just think that I am very passionate about this topic, because these last points too, especially talk about how difficult the role the business analysts have. Whoever's doing business analysis, let's just put business analysts aside. Whoever's doing it, whoever gets stuck with that hot potato when things start to go sideways, it is incredibly challenging. I, as a consultant in the later years of my consulting career, which is still sort of ongoing, I guess you could say, I will step in and fill that capability. And playing the business analyst role effectively, I'm talking to C-suite executives. I'm guiding project managers on the scope of the project. I'm letting IT know that what their plan is, where it's going to fail, because there's not going to be a successful translation. You can't hire somebody off the street to do that for your organization who doesn't have a lot of different training and a multidisciplinary approach. So, I mean, a lot of it is, I think this role just needs to be totally redefined. I think, and it's really just the function. You have to understand the function first. Get away from the people that do it. What is the
Exactly.
function you need? You can teach the business. I've been in that situation too, where I said, you're not in, like, when you talk about business analysis at scale, and that people fail with that a lot, you can start by just teaching more business analysis to the business. If your business people are going to go in and try to speak Russian to somebody they don't know the language, you can hire a translator, or you can teach them some basic Russian. Does that make
Which is
sense? It's capability building. We have to just know what we're trying to do.
100%. It's tough though, because you see those organizations that try teaching lean, it takes to varying degrees, or it starts being used as a way to get what they want. I would say, for my summation, that the key is, we're not saying that there has to be even designated business analysts in the role. There certainly doesn't have to be business requirements documentation that's a certain way. But what you need is, if you can't articulate what is the process of converting business problems into technical solutions, and what that traceability is, you're not going to be successful. If you can, no matter what it looks like, no matter who in fact is doing it, without judging it, without saying, oh, that shouldn't be the way it is, etc. But if you can, you have a chance to iterate and start plugging in the right plugs to whatever that process is, and that's where I would start.
Yeah, and that's going to be my ultimate actionable, I guess, insight from this, which is the traceability, the transparency, and the accountability. Forget business analysis, forget the whole role, forget trying to hire somebody to do this. You have to have a function first. That's exactly what Jonathan just said. The whole function's job is to ensure transparency in the conversation, accountability, and traceability. Somebody has to be accountable for their actions and where the information is coming from. And we all know fundamentally it comes from business to outlying groups to create action. So like, if you can't have somebody whose function is to make sure that's happening, and not heavy documents, just in some way there's accountability and traceability, that you can start from there and be very, very successful if you're listening and you have this problem we're talking about.
And I'll just add one last thing. When we say accountability, it's not so that somebody can blame whoever for something going wrong. It's just clear who in fact owns this and how is it being owned. And then if you don't like what that looks like, you can place the accountability where it belongs, and then you
Yes.
can judge and measure. But while you're trying to figure out, transparency and blame are not, and growth in an organization and blame do not go well at all. And if you have a process that's transparent, then you find the word blame or judging, that can work. In the absence of it, that you're not going to make it, that's not going to lead to more transparency.
And with that,
So
we've barely scratched the surface of business analysis probably, but we're at the end of our time today. So I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation, and there will be more to come about this
don't
topic and
forget to
others.
like.
Don't forget to, do all the things.